Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to take a look at how to best secure your managed and unmanaged devices, as well as best practices around remote access to not just your cloud apps, but also to remote apps as well. I have two great guests today. My first guest is David Gregory, and he will be followed by Chris Jackson. So Chris, let's start with you. Introduce yourself. Say hi to all of the folks.
Hey, nice to see everyone. Chris Jackson, and I am a principal architect inside of our commercial endpoint engineering, focusing on Windows security.
Awesome. Thank you. And David.
Thanks, Stephen, for having me today. My name is David Gregory, and I'm a program manager in the Azure AD product group. In my 16 years here at Microsoft, I've focused on identity. And you know what keeps me in identity? The rare opportunity to create win-win scenarios, where we can help improve the user experience, but also help improve security.
Awesome. Thanks for joining. And I'm also proud to say that today I have a full Chicago contingency. I grew up in Chicago. Chris Jackson is there. David is there. So we're coming from Chicago, and afterwards we'll have some deep dish pizza and we'll debate what pizza is better. But first, let's start with securing remote access to applications. So David, as we have seen, IT pros have now gotten Teams out, they've gotten all the Microsoft 365 services turned on, but the big concern now is they're now going back and looking to lock everything down is how do we secure all of those applications? Because we've got, internal apps and external apps and cloud apps and Proxy, et cetera. So kind of walk us through how we should take a look at how we secure access to all of your apps anywhere. Why don't we start with something, I don't know, maybe app Proxy. It might be a good place to start.
That's a great starting point, Stephen. So first off, I wanted to say that traditionally when we work with customers, we've worked on their long-term identity roadmaps. And over the last few months, we've had to pivot to how can we deliver value in just a few weeks' time. And so the best advice I can give up front is just to be realistic about your goals. What can you accomplish in the next few weeks? Be super focused and think very tactically.
Okay.
Now,
yep. Go ahead.
And to expand on that, over these last few months, we've learned from numerous customers that they didn't build their VPN to sustain 100% remote workforce. And so many customers required users to be on the network to gain access to those applications. And so now they're quickly having to pivot to another solution set to provide access while also providing security. And so that's where customers are seeing value in Azure Active Directory and especially our app Proxy. So I'm going to do a demo here. Installing the Azure App Proxy is easy enough. You're going to go into our Azure AD portal here, and you're going to go to Application Proxy. And then you'll see here, I can go ahead and download the connector. So you're going to download this connector, as you can see there. And then a couple requirements. Each app proxy agent must have line of sight to the applications you want to publish. So we're not going to just publish every application that's in your enterprise. You have to pick the ones you want to publish. And because of that, the app proxy needs line of sight to those applications. And secondly, if you want to do integrated Windows authentication, the app proxy must also have line of sight to a domain controller. So with those things in mind, installing the app proxy is easy enough. You put the agent on a Windows server and you go ahead and install. Now, one thing to note is you can have multiple app proxies. So if you want load balancing or a high availability, you can install multiple app proxy agents. So now that the installation is done, we're going to go back into Azure AD and tell app proxy to publish a specific application. So we're going to go into Enterprise Applications, and I'm going to go to All Applications, and then I'm going to go to New Application, and I'm going to go to On-Premises Application. And from there, I can go and give it a name, give it an internal URL, and tell it how I want Azure AD to authenticate the user. Now, I did want to expand this for a second. If you've uploaded a custom SSL cert, you can use custom domain names, and we certainly recommend you do this. And secondly, under here, you can pick how Azure Active Directory will authenticate the user. And so from here, you can say, hey, this is going to be passed through, or we're not going to do any authentication, or I want Azure AD to do the pre-authentication of that user. And that's what's going to enable you to enforce things like multi-factor authentication and other conditional access policies.
So rather than, going through a split tunnel or, having to use VPN, this is going to reduce that load, make it easier, and add a layer of security, correct?
Absolutely. Doesn't require VPN. The app proxy connectors only require outbound ports, so you don't have to open up any ports into your firewall.
Right.
But we also are going to provide that security to authenticate the user and apply conditional access policies like multi-factor authentication, which I have right here on this slide.
Right.
So once you've registered the app, you're going to go and find the app in our conditional access blade. And then you're going to say, we're going to require multi-factor authentication on that app.
Awesome. And as we've seen, when you take a look at things like Secure Score, enabling MFA is one of the first and best things you can do to raise that score and move things forward, and something we recommend to our customers to really, a simple thing that you can do to increase security.
Absolutely. Now, I do have some additional best practices for app proxy.
Mm-hmm.
There are some capacity limits that you should be aware of. So we have a cloud service throttling limit as well as a connector server capacity limit. And when we're done here, we're going to share links with you. They'll provide you with more documentation on each of these.
Great.
But the takeaway here is that you really need to watch the utilization and the transactions per second just to make sure that those app proxies aren't being overloaded. And then you can, of course, scale out those connectors if you need more. And then just a few more, like I said earlier, using custom domains so that the internal and external URLs match. Place connectors as close to the apps to reduce latency. And then we have some additional best practices here. And like I said, we'll share this when you're done with links to each of these.
Now, that's great if we have on-premise apps, but what about enabling things for like remote work or apps in O365 or SaaS apps, that we're using with Azure AD?
For things like Office 365 or, even third-party SaaS apps that you might have integrated with Azure AD, we're seeing customers want to shift those users away from requiring being on network as well. Now, when we talk to customers over the last few weeks, most customers said, instead of being on network, I'd rather that we shift to a device policy where you have to be on an enrolled or managed device. And so what we learned from talking to those customers is that many of them weren't ready to take that posture, meaning they didn't have all their devices enrolled into Azure AD or into Intune. And so, what we've learned is that, if you can pivot off of the device, that's great. But for many customers, just enforcing multi-factor authentication is probably going to be more practical.
All right. Is there a demo you can walk us through as we're going through this?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
So let me go ahead and share my desktop again. Now, before you roll out multi-factor authentication across the enterprise, we do recommend that you enable something called Converge Registration. Now, this went public preview just, I want to say, a week or two ago. But this allows you to have one place to register the users for both multi-factor authentication and self-service password reset. So we're going to go to user settings and go to user feature previews. And we're going to say users can preview features for registering and managing security info. And you can turn that on for a group of users or for all users. And so then at that point, users can start registering. And we next recommend you monitor the MFA registration to say, hey, are people registering? Are they having success with registration? Are they having issues? And so you can go to usage and insights and go to authentication methods activity. And you can see a report for how users are registering for multi-factor authentication, or whether they're not, and what the success is of that. So now you can really take that success and pass it back to your leadership and say how you're making progress towards that registration.
So as we take a look at this, how do we get from what the baselines are to what we really think that they should be?
That's a great question. The quickest way to enforce multi-factor authentication is through our security defaults. And so with security defaults, you can just turn on MFA for all your users immediately. Like I said, just very quick, very seamless. But you do have to make sure this is turned on. So you'd want to go to the properties in the Azure AD portal and go to manage security defaults and just make sure that's turned on. That's certainly the quickest way.
Okay.
But for many of our customers, they are using the full conditional access. So they have, lots of policies with lots of conditions and granularity. And so they might need to take a different tactic. Now, what we've found from talking to these customers is many of them had a conditional access policy that blocked users that were off the corporate network. And so first, what we want to do is say, you know what, we're going to pivot from requiring a network to be on the network to instead enforcing multi-factor authentication. So as you can see here, I'm going to go to a conditional access policy. It says block outside corporate network. I'm going to go to conditions and I'm going to say locations. And I'm going to turn this off now. You'll see I'll turn that off. But now we're going to go back to our controls and say, you know what, I'm now going to enforce multi-factor authentication. And so that's a recommended, at a minimum, require multi-factor authentication. Like I said earlier, if your devices are already enrolled or registered with Intune or Azure AD, you can also select that. And that's where this radio control down at the bottom really becomes powerful, because it allows you to say, hey, if the device is already registered with Azure AD, the enterprise can accept that as a security control. But if the device isn't registered with Azure AD, well, we're going to prompt them for multi-factor, as a fallback. So this gives you a way to kind of be more flexible with your security policies.
What if folks don't have Intune? What if they have third-party like AirWatch Mobile Iron? Will this still work? Is there anything that absolutely has to have Microsoft Intune in order to do these in the steps up to this point?
On Windows devices, they can either be domain joined or what's called Azure AD joined. And both of those will satisfy the enrolled or compliant status.
Okay.
On the mobile side, we of course support Intune, and I think we will be announcing some integrations with other third parties for that sort of compliance check.
Great. And of course, we want folks to use Intune. It's going to work great, but some folks have made investments elsewhere, and it's important to understand what works and what doesn't.
Absolutely. Now, I do have one more best practice I wanted to get out there
Please.
that we've seen with a few customers just in the last few weeks. We've had several big customers that say, I want to allow my remote workforce, but I want to just allow the Office 365 apps, and I'd like to block everything else. And so this traditionally has been pretty difficult because you've had to go in and explicitly, block all apps, but then explicitly, whitelist the Office 365 apps.
Right.
And so we now have a new Office 365 umbrella application that encompasses all the apps and all the service dependencies in one application. So if I go to security here, and once again, go to conditional access, and then I go to cloud apps or actions, and I go to all cloud apps. But now I can say exclude, and I can say exclude the Office 365 preview. All right, and this includes all the applications and service dependencies of Office 365. And now I can just say, you know what? I'm going to block all apps except Office 365. And one more nugget here I wanted to include is that if you're going to do a broad block like this, we do recommend you first do it in what's called report only mode. And this is effectively like you get to audit how the policy would be enforced on users if you enabled it.
And that's really critical because you don't want a ton of users calling you saying all of a sudden we can't use this, and I used it yesterday and it stopped working, and why. And you're probably going to want to let people know when you're moving to this sort of model.
Absolutely. So you just enable report only mode, and now you can go back to your workbooks, conditional access insights, and you can see we have certain policies in report only mode. We can select those policies, and now we can see what the result of that policy would be if it were enabled.
Awesome. We have one or two questions. Somebody asked, will legacy auth get blocked if we enable security defaults? And Kana said, yes, that is correct. But I want to know, are there any things to really be aware of or things that we should be cautious of when doing that?
Kana said yes. My initial thinking is the logic behind that is when we're using security defaults, we're enforcing multi-factor authentication, and legacy authentication is not going to be able to properly handle that, that multi-factor authentication prompt. So I suspect that is definitely the case.
Okay. And another question was, does the Azure App Proxy have a cost? And we had stated it comes with Azure AD Premium P1. Anything you want to add there on that?
No, that's absolutely accurate. And once you have those premium P1 licenses for your users, there's no additional cost for each application you onboard. It's just a fixed cost per user per month.
Awesome. Any kind of final thoughts, words as folks start to play with this and start to use this? Gotchas, things that they should be cautious of, or just a really great resource that you encourage folks to check out before they start going down this path?
Absolutely. I certainly recommend you check out our, the Microsoft blogs, the Azure AD blogs in particular. We're always talking about new features or new public previews that we're releasing, just so you can keep abreast of how quickly things are changing.
Great. And they can also follow you at David_A_Gregory on Twitter. And I'm assuming you post a lot of this there too, correct?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Stick around. I'm going to head over to Chris Jackson now. So we've just started talking about secure managed, unmanaged devices. You and I had the conversation last week that, like I said, security baselines are really the beginning. It's not the end all. So how do we look at increasing those security configurations and take what's at baseline and make it better, add some goodness to it?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And we have a lot of folks who are coming from a background of, I'm going to really rely on my perimeter security, right? And it's really, when David started off the conversation talking about identity, I think that's absolutely the right place to start, is that identity really is the new security perimeter. And if the physical boundaries no longer matter as much. But there's still a lot of organizations that are evolving into that position. And so the question is, how do I then start to apply, more appropriate device protections? So we'll go ahead and kind of, show off a place to start and then give some recommendations about it. On the screen, I'm showing from Microsoft Endpoint Manager the new Endpoint Security Hub. And it's in this hub that we have the security baselines. And security baselines we've built for Windows 10, we've built for Defender ATP, and we've built for Edge so far and integrated those into Intune. And it is in here that I can go through and create a new profile that's going to take all of that recommended guidance. So I can say, I'm going to make the Win 10 baseline, and all of these settings that are enumerated here represent that kind of guidance. Here's what we think is the best answer for generically everyone to start with. Now, all of these are modifiable because even though we say it's a great place to start, there are lots of reasons why you may have to deviate from these baselines. Typically, app compat reasons is one that comes to mind is, yeah, I'd love to have that control put in place, but then my entire world will break. And that's actually an important concept, is understanding what the impact will be. Because if I'm coming from an environment where everyone is a local admin, they all can do whatever they want to on their end device, if I slap on full baseline, that's probably going to be a pretty bad day, because baselines are kind of what organizations like, the three-letter agencies in the U.S. federal government will run. And that's going to be pretty disruptive if that's the environment I'm coming from. So I wanted to kind of point out some guidance that we've been building to recommend for, hey, how do I start my journey if I'm really at the entry point? So we've built some guidance that we call the Security Configuration Framework. I call it SecCon because it reminds me of DEF CON, which kind of reminds me of the movie War Games. But with the SecCon framework, I can go through and choose, hey, am I just getting started? This is a collection of the settings from the baseline that I can probably get deployed in the next 30 to 60 days. Then I can look at, 90 days, and then, maybe I have a long-term initiative. And they're all sort of grouped together where we have this guidance. It's up on GitHub, so it's open source. It's taking feedback from folks where I can go through and see what those settings are. So if I'm contemplating doing some deviations, I can go and look, where do they fall in terms of SecCon? And certainly we are thinking about how do we integrate this more into the UI, so it's not just a giant, HTML table. But to give that guidance of how do I get started hardening my devices.
So real quick before you go forward, GitHub is available to everyone. It's free. You just log in, and then they just search SecCon to get to this, correct?
Yeah, or you can go to aka.ms/seccon framework. And that's the other thing as well, right? Is that this is an Intune construct. All of these are also available as part of the security compliance toolkit. So if you're managing policies via GPO, presumably you're sort of solved for how do I do GPO on a longer wire from a work from home scenario. But there's even, with some tooling built into the toolkit like lgpo.exe that allows me to apply it through local GPOs. So we really do want to make this guidance something that you can take and embrace regardless of the avenue through which you take it.
So we've just talked about what if you're in a high security environment and productivity. Is there a chance that some of this is going to block things that people have already done? What are the, device and compliance risks as we start to do this and as we look to kind of tweak this?
Yeah, so it's a good point. So definitely from how do I tweak it, I would look to the guidance from SecCon and then look holistically because, how do I configure the policy is really just one aspect of understanding the risk of those devices. And I want to kind of tie it back to something that David was talking about before, which is conditional access. And he mentioned compliance policies. And I want to go through and create a compliance policy. I'm going to make it for Windows 10. I am doing live demos, so they're not click-throughs here. And as I like to say, there's no such thing as a failed demo. There's only an unplanned debugging demo. So if we come across anything there, we'll be able to look there. But we'll just call this Win 10 compliance. And, as we get into the settings, we'll notice that if I am using Defender ATP, not only can I base my trust decisions on hey, does this identity look to be compromised? Does the device have things applied? But I can also emit signals from, hey, what's the threat protection on the device? So if I say I want to require that the machine risk score, which is there are alerts on the device that represent a certain risk. So something potentially bad has happened. Maybe I want to gate compliance with you are not using a device that has unresolved alerts on that device. So certainly I can, apply it to, hey, I can have a minimum OS version. I can look at, does it have BitLocker enabled and other policies there. But importantly, I can look at the actual point in time state of the device. Does there appear to be malicious software already running on that device?
And this is incredibly important if somebody is using a bring your own, BYOD device that they're now leveraging. You don't want them infecting the network, which is important because a lot of folks did not bring home a work laptop or don't have one. They're coming from a personal machine. So setting this is going to ensure that they're not taking infections on their device, moving it to the data that's stored in the cloud with other key data, or even worse, on a file server somewhere.
Yeah, allows you to make those trust decisions based upon the trustworthiness point in time of the device.
Okay. How else do we look to harden this, and what are some other things that our administrators should be aware of as they're managing these new devices that are new to their network, or now ones that are not physically inside the building and not under their control? Things like app protection policies, TVM, etc.
Yeah, well, there's a few things, right? And we're kind of looking at one of them right now, and certainly you and I have discussed, keeping operating systems up to date for quite some time. And that's something that comes up and is certainly exposed. But more and more, as people get better at, hardening the OS, at distributing patches and everything else, it is becoming the application plane where we start to see a lot of the risk. And that's an area that we've been investing in as well. So in addition to showing the risk based on the OS version, we now also have the option to explore the risk based on the software that's on the device. So kind of clicking over to another demo here to take a look at what we call the Threat and Vulnerability Management, or TVM, which is an area of the product that can look for, hey, show me what are the key recommendations for these devices. So as long as I have, the Sense agent running and collecting data, I can see not just, hey, Windows is out of date, but hey, you should probably update some of the software that's on here. And we can take a look at, not only what the software is, but if we can kind of look here at, hey, three different dimensions. Number one, has an exploit been developed? Is someone attacking me? And is something going on in my environment? So I can really pull out, hey, this is something, in this case, we have a verified exploit is publicly available. We've got nothing on the other two. I don't know if I have anything here. Here's one where, I don't have anyone that's configured, but it really shows some details on where should I look to next. And, from the conversations I've had with folks who are looking after security around devices, this is the single most important thing is what's the next most important thing I should do? I've never run into anyone who has no to-do list and was like, hey, I got nothing to do. Can you give me something to do? Instead, it's what should I go do next?
Yeah.
And
it's also important to call out that there's an export feature here. So if customers are using Jira or a third party, they can export this into that third party and leverage it, but they're not going to get some of the AI functionality and things like that we can set up so that when certain criteria is met, certain actions are automatically kicked off for that administrator.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And however I manage that, it just gives me some real data on the context of my organization on both applications, but we're also going to look at device configuration. So if you've not gone through and done a security baseline, for example, we'll tell you like, hey, we recommend that Credential Guard is a really important thing for you to go and get enabled.
So we have a question, Chris. When will MS Defender ATP be able to install updates automatic? So automatic remediation.
There's actually a couple of things with that we're working on. So in terms of when, as with all software that's not done, the answer is when it's done. I'll tell you that the two priorities we have that we're investigating at the moment, one of them is not, auto update, but rather how do I at least stop you from running the vulnerable one? Because there is often a cycle where, hey, we've got to validate something new that comes in, but in the interim, we may want to be able to very quickly stop something from running. So I would say that's the one that we're addressing with the highest priority is how do we say, hey, you're running, say, an older version of the stock viewer application that I wrote. I may want to say, you know what, we're actually starting to see threats in my environment. Stop this from executing in the environment until we address it, because I have active threats that are targeted at me. And then the secondary one is to continue to improve that workflow between Defender ATP and Intune. So it's just, hey, you're out of date. What's your workflow to validate and get that deployed? And how do I chase that through and see it so I can kind of see end to end that progress that I'm making on going through, or understand, okay, why am I taking a while to deploy this that I may or may not want to go through and do that yet, keeping in mind that availability is also a security risk.
Then we had a question on TVM remediation features. What are things that we should be looking at there, or any specific guidance that you have around that?
Yeah, so we're fairly early on when it comes to remediation. It's kind of sort of a similar question to one that we just talked about. So right now we can, take this and in essence, open up a ticket, so I can, note what's happening, right? In this options, I can say open up a ticket in Intune, which will notify the administrator of what's happening. So I can put in that request for remediation today. And then the folks in Intune would get that to show up. So if I say, oh, open a ticket in Intune, I'm going to call this high priority, and I want to please have that done by, say, I'll give it 14 days, and, this is important, and I can submit that request. And then what I should see, assuming the demo gods are on my side today, is that I should see that show up as a security task, and I can see them showing up here, and here we go. It has come through. I see it's high priority, and I can either, as the IT admin, accept the request to send the update out or reject it.
And is that going to go to everybody when we do that? Again, should IT administrators look to do a small pilot with this, test it, or most of these mainstream updates generally be pretty okay, not going to break things? What's your thoughts there? Because I know you get asked that a lot.
I think it depends on the software, right? In this case, right, if it's Adobe Reader, it's one of those things that my general tendency would be just take it.
Yeah.
It's a document reader application. There's probably not a lot of things that are built on top of it. So this is a lower risk one to put through versus an application that's really, if we look in here, JRE. If I just update the JRE, there are breaking changes that come in. There's also a lot of risk. So I actually have a decision I need to think through. I need to validate my key software, but I also don't want to just not update Java because we know that has been the source of a lot of pretty bad things happening in the past.
Yes, exactly. All right. And then last but not least, data protection framework. What about app protection policies as a whole? What advice do you have for folks when taking a look at that? Or what are common mistakes that people make that they should be aware of as they start to delve in there?
Oh, sure. So let's take a look at that. And we talk about app protection policies is, have the ability to go through and create them. And I'll just make one for iOS because we do see a lot of folks coming in with the devices they have at home. So I'll make an app protection policy. I can go and choose the apps that I want to go through and protect. And one of the things that I am a really, really huge proponent of is to, wherever you can, stick with well-known and proven solutions. In fact, that's one of the search engine. I'm going to do a live demo of searching.
Ooh.
But sticking with well-known and proven solutions actually is a query that happens often enough. But we actually link directly to this from our security baselines documentation, and it's a blog post that I send people all the time, where you do things like, hey, if every piece of software needs custom repackaging that is unique to your environment, or really, this is another great one. If the person who manages your app deployments get hit by a truck, you'll probably go out of business.
That would be a good one, yes.
Things like that. Like this stuff really happens. So instead of just going through and trying to pick the best answer, we did some work very, very similar to SecCon, right? In fact, based upon the work we did in the security configuration framework, to do a data protection framework using app protection policies, where we again go through these multiple levels, basic, enhanced, and high, depending upon what are the categories of the device that you're trying to protect. So you can go through and say, all right, hey, how do we release it? And here's a ringed approach that talks about exactly how to approach this framework. And then here are the settings. We're going to list, these are the first-party Microsoft apps that we recommend protecting. Here are the settings and for which platforms they apply. And what do we suggest you should configure them to? So you can go through and pick the apps off of that list. So I'm just going to pick a couple. I'm not going to go through the entire workflow here, but let's say I'm going to do Teams and Edge because those are the two apps that I'm using. And then I can get into the data protection requirements and leverage this framework to help me pick an answer based upon the security posture of the device that I'm trying to configure. And this allows me to hit what initially may seem like a paradox, which is I want to protect devices that I don't manage.
Right.
How really do you do that? And it's like, well, you actually don't have to be enrolled. App protection does not require you to be enrolled and have the device fully managed. It will just apply to those apps running on that device. The app, still belongs there. So you can kind of really think through this continuum of, I'm going to protect your apps. It's not my device. I really shouldn't have my grubby hands on it. To, I'm going to manage the device. So I'm going to MDM join it so I can start to push down policy. To, I'm going to Azure AD join the remote device. And you kind of get more convenience features for working from home. So I, for example, this is my home device and I have an Azure AD joined. It belongs to me. So it's not, actually something that work really has a right to control over, but boy, it makes the sort of single sign-on experience magnificent.
Yeah.
So it's a trade-off I'm willing to make, whereas other people are like, nope, stay out of my business. So maybe I'll let you MDM manage it, but I'm not going to let you get access to everything, or I'm not even going to let you do that. And you can start to make these decisions based upon, how tightly managed is the device, what is the configuration of the device.
We got another question. Web content filtering on MDATP. Microsoft intends to integrate completely instead of using third parties.
That is true. And I have no idea what the announcement procedure is to put that out there, but that initially was the plan, was to allow third parties to put the web content filtering in place. And we got a lot of feedback, and we're always listening to that feedback. The feedback was, I really dislike having to go and do 2 negotiations just to implement a security control. So, I want to make it really, really easy and straightforward in order to, get this control in place and get that enforcement built up.
Right. One of our moderators, Antonio, said, yes, it will soon be announced that WCF will be done natively in MDATP without requiring licensing or integration with a third-party feed.
Mm-hmm.
That was it for our questions, and we are almost out of time, so I have one more question for each of you. Chris, if someone has not followed a lot of this, they've just thrown out a default security baseline, they're starting to lock down their devices, what is the one thing, top of the list, that they should do first before they do anything else?
Give me some framework. What's the next most important thing to do? That's a loaded question.
And we'll say for BYOD devices, and then David, this is going to come at you next, so you can start to think. But hey, all my users are running their own devices. If I have to pick just one thing, what is the first thing that someone, especially if they don't know about it, should really take a look at?
So where I would start, if I've not really done wide scale BYOD before, is I would take that, sort of tiered approach, right? Of, what do I need to control in order to give you access to this data? Build that taxonomy and understand what controls you need to insist on to get that level of protection. Because right now we are absolutely seeing a huge influx of attacks like ransomware attacks that are targeting devices that just don't have the same level of protection, but now have access to much more sensitive information that you're, much more concerned about.
Yeah.
And so it gives a lot more surface area. So really decide up front, what do you need to do to get people productive right now? And what controls do you need to do to give this tiered level of access? So instead of thinking that everything's important, the advice I always give is,
right,
everything's important, nothing's important. Get that taxonomy and just, be willing to enforce it, number one. And number two, be willing to live with it yourself. If I'm looking at starting to apply baselines, apply them on your own device first.
Yeah.
And get a sense of what that's like so that you can say, you know what, we need to detune this just for user experience. But get started with that taxonomy.
And it really is about securing the data over the device. The device, it's important to make sure that it's healthy. That's critical, but it is about when we all go back to work and people are no longer using that home device, or we're going to get them a managed device. How do we ensure they can no longer access data on that, or if they give it away to somebody else, that doesn't stay without removing the content, that the things that are important to them. So it is that fine line, and you're right. David, same question to you.
Thanks, Stephen. You said there's a lot of kind of BYOD, people bringing their own devices, and at the end of the day, it's about protecting the data.
Mm-hmm.
And so while a couple things I would suggest are if you decide on what your security posture is going to be to protect that data, is multi-factor and verifying who that user is that going to be enough? If not, look at things like Azure AD Join. That will allow that user to enroll their device and attest that it's enrolled and compliant. And then also, lastly, the thing to look at too is within our conditional access, you can configure something called session controls. And so what you can now do is, based on whether that device is enrolled and compliant, then when they go into the application can change their posture. For example, like Outlook Web Access can be configured so that if the device is, not enrolled, that they can't download any files. So that would be the third thing, is that session controls within our conditional access.
Awesome. Gentlemen, we are out of time. This was great. Thank you so much. Any final words, Mr. Jackson?
Just be mindful, as you point out, what really matters is the data. But we need to have that chain of trust, and it extends from the keyboard back to the back-end data. So anything from getting people productive to folks who have privileged access, and that's a really important thing, right? If I have privileged access to something, understand and put in the right controls from the keyboard all the way through to the content, and all of the ways that someone could potentially go in and mount an attack against me, understand that whole transition and protect everything to the extent that you possibly can without disrupting the experience, and you'll have happy users and not have a very bad day.
Beautifully put. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Make sure to tune in to our next webcast in the series next week. Visit us at aka.ms/enabling remote work. We have a very special guest next week, so make sure you catch us. And if you're catching this on replay, feel free to reach out to David A. Gregory with underscores in between each of those on Twitter, @CompatGuy, or myself, Stephen L. Rose. Until next week, thanks for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.